I'm not really sure why the Kanto Pokédex is so poison type heavy. I mean, we're only 19 species in, and we've already covered, what, 6? 7 different species that have the poison typing? And it's not like the region is overly developed. I mean, it's nothing like my home region of Unova. But nevertheless, there is a ton of poison Pokemon present in the Kanto region. And today, we add another one to the list with the Venonat line. Hello, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go over how you would care for and raise different species of Pokemon in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Pokemon Venonat and its evolution Venomoth. Venonat is a 3-foot tall, 66-pound bug Pokemon, shaped like a big, round, fuzzy purple ball. It has 2 small hands and feet, 2 white antennas coming off the top of its head, and, most strikingly, 2 large red compound eyes over a mouth with 2 large pincers. When it evolves, it gets taller, at almost 5 feet tall, but also gets a lot lighter, now only being an average of 27.5 pounds. This lighter weight is because it now needs to fly, having a pair of large purple wings. Its center body is segmented into 3 sections, with large eyes and a crest on its head. It now has 6 small white legs that it keeps close to its body, and a striped thorax. In all, it's a major change from when evolving, the 2 almost looking nothing alike. So let's get into the guide and figure out if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. One major thing you have to be aware of when talking of this line of Pokemon is that they are very poisonous. I mean, they earn that poison typing. Venonat fur is covered in a poisonous liquid that can be dispersed around itself if it shakes vigorously. Venomoth, much like Butterfree, releases poisonous scales from its wings as it flaps, except that the poison on Venomoth's scales is much more potent than the paralytic on Butterfree's. Both the liquid and the scales can lead to a trip to the doctors or the hospital if you get a large enough dose. So the enclosures for these Pokemon are going to have to take that into consideration. To start with, this is going to be another fully enclosed enclosure, just like the last one we had to do with Paris. I would recommend the same setup, with a greenhouse-like building. The walls can either be fully clear or opaque, so long as you allow the natural light to come inside. Size-wise, you'll be looking at different sizes depending on whether you have a Venonat or a Venomoth. With Venonat, consider something that's about 20 feet by 20 feet, which will provide plenty of space for not only the Pokemon, but also the decorations, which we'll talk about in a second. Venomoth will require a bit more room than its pre-evolution, since it'll need some room to fly around. A 30 by 30 enclosure should be large enough for Venomoth. For Venonat, the height won't really matter, but for Venomoth, you'll need a ceiling height of at least 15 feet. Possibly even more. As for the floor of the enclosure, these aren't actually Pokemon that'll dig, so you can just have the building resting on the grass, allowing for a more natural feel to the enclosure and saving slightly on the expense of getting it built. Now, this also brings us back to the decorations of the interior. These Pokemon usually live in temperate forest regions, places that experience warm summers, cold winters, and both seasons in between. This means that the interior of the enclosure should reflect the ideal of this area. A mild temperature, mild humidity, and a few trees that your Pokemon can climb and live inside. Now, of course that doesn't mean that you're growing full oak and maple trees in your enclosure. There's no way that it's big enough to accommodate even one of those monsters. But what you can do is get fake ones. There are stores online that you can buy fake trees from that'll fit the height of the 15-foot ceiling. They may also be buried in the ground slightly, thus anchoring them and allowing the enclosure to get even closer to the Pokemon's natural habitat. As for the number of trees that you could get, I would think that 3 would be the most comfortable number to go with. Any more and your enclosure may start to feel too cramped for your Pokemon, especially Venomoth with its wings. Also, if you're going to be housing a Venonat, then be sure to get one of the trees with a hole in the side, large enough for the Pokemon to be able to climb into and sleep in. Venonat use these holes in trees as their dens, so if your Pokemon to feel safe and protected inside its enclosure, you're going to need one of the trees to have one. As for Venomoth, they just tend to cling to the trunk or branches of a tree instead of making a nest, so no worries there. Before we move on, there is a few things that we should talk about regarding the structure of the enclosure, and one of them would be the door. Obviously, you're going to need a way to get into the enclosure to clean up after your Pokemon and water the grass inside. But this can't just be some regular door for a few reasons, and both are because of the poison that these Pokemon give off. One is that you'll need a food slot at the bottom of the door. As we'll talk about later on in the guide, this is where you'll be sliding in the food, unless you feel like getting dressed up in a hazmat suit just to feed your Pokemon. As for the second part of the door that makes it non-regular, it's that when the door is closed, you should make sure that it's an airtight seal. By that, I mean you should be sure that none of the poison can get out of the enclosure. With Venonat, it's not really much of a worry, as the poison mist clouds that it can make through shaking don't spread very far. But the scales that come off Venomoth can spread very far, so it's important that you make sure that the entire enclosure, including the door, is airtight and sealed to make sure that the scales can't get out and spread. This is for the safety of you, anyone else nearby the enclosure, or any other Pokemon that could come nearby. To that end, we'll need to install an air filtration system into the enclosure as well. Since it's going to be entirely sealed, this will allow new fresh air to come in, and it'll pull the air that's filled with the poison out and filter it. This has the benefit of keeping the enclosure somewhat clean, allowing for longer breaks between having to go in and clean up the scales. However, this does mean that you'll need to change out the filters and get new ones when they get all gunked up with the scales and poison. When doing this, be sure to have a full body coverage. I'm talking gas masks, gloves, maybe even a full hazmat suit. One can never be too careful when talking about poison. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with these Pokemon, the answer is going to be simple. Only other Venonat evolutions should be housed with them. Thanks to the poison that these Pokemon give off, the only ones that'll be totally immune to it would be other members of their own species. I suppose there are some Pokemon that would be fine, like a few of the artificial Pokemon like Magnemite and Voltorb, since they don't breathe or have skin to absorb the poison, but I'm not 100% on that, so I just wouldn't try it. It's best that you just keep it to the Venonat species, and always remember that I only give you the specs for one Pokemon in the enclosure. If you're going to be getting more than one, you'll have to adjust the space of the enclosure accordingly, and add in some more nesting spots for the Venonat. Availability. I'm going to start this right away with you're going to need to get a permit to have one of these Pokemon. Just like the Ekans line, the poison secreted from these Pokemon is very dangerous, and can cause a lot of harm to you or other people in Pokemon if they get out or the poison is not appropriately dealt with. So you'll have to go through some classes, pass some tests, and get the permit before you can even start to look for one of these Pokemon to keep. That's just how it is with a lot of these poison-type Pokemon. Once you have your permit, and the government won't be kicking down your door for illegally keeping a bug on your property, finding one in the wild shouldn't be that hard. Of course, the larger populations are in Kanto, along the eastern route and Safari Zone, and in Johto, at the Lake of Rage in Ilex Forest. However, there are also populations in Paldea and Kalos, along with being rarely spotted in Unova and Sinnoh. Unfortunately, for those of you in the Hoenn, Galar, and Alolan regions, there aren't any wild populations to speak of. So for you, you'll have to travel to a different region to find one. But I'm going to insert my 2 cents here and say that I don't think anyone but highly trained professionals should be going out to catch these Pokemon. Thanks to their highly toxic nature, someone that is unprepared or doesn't know what they're getting themselves into can easily put themselves in a lot of danger. hunting these Pokemon is not for the average person. So, that brings us to the breeder scene. But that prospect may not be as easy as you think. As you saw in the Enclosure section, these Pokemon pretty much poison the air around them. Which means that for someone to not only raise these Pokemon, but attempt to breed them and sell them, that person is going to be taking on a high chance of being poisoned by the very Pokemon they're trying to raise. And it's not the Pokemon's fault, it's just how their biology works. But that does mean that a lot of breeders, myself included, aren't willing to take that risk. Combine that with the facts that you need a permit to even get these Pokemon, and that there won't be a big market of people looking to buy them, and that leads to a major shortage in availability of these Pokemon. So finding a breeder that's willing to sell you these Pokemon is going to be a long process, and when you do find them, then it most likely won't be cheap. No matter what way you go, whether it be a wild Pokemon or a breeder raised one, this is a Pokemon that'll probably be hard for you to get your hands on. Care. Caring for these Pokemon is going to be very hands-off. As I've mentioned multiple times, the level of toxicity that you can get just by being near these Pokemon means that you won't be entering the enclosure to play with them or to hang out with them. I mean, unless you decide to wear a hazmat suit while doing so, which I wouldn't want to do, but you do you. Even if you do go in and hang out in the hazmat suit, these Pokemon aren't exactly the cuddly, snuggly type. For one, they're nocturnal. So if you want to hang out with them, then you'll have to be in there late at night after the sun goes down. And even then, they tend to avoid large creatures like humans, only focused on finding prey. So even if you are in there late at night, in your hazmat suit, sitting still, the most that they're likely to do is to come over and investigate you and then ignore you when you turn out not to be food or a threat. That's the unfortunate reality of a lot of bug-type Pokemon. When it comes to the food situation, these Pokemon are carnivorous, hunting and feeding on smaller bug Pokemon. Mostly this means Caterpie, but they will feed on others like Scatterbug or even Swaddle. So that does mean that you'll be needing to feed them thawed out meat for their meals. I always recommend Caterpie, but that's just personal preference. Really, any bug meat would do. Just be sure to feed your Venonat 2 cups of food and your Venomoth 2.5 cups. I know it might seem weird to feed your Venomoth more than your Venonat since it weighs less, but it does fly and thus uses up a lot of energy. When it comes to the amount of feedings, you're going to be giving it to them in one big feeding. In the wild, these Pokemon tend to hunt one prey a night and fill themselves on that prey, leading to them only needing one feeding a night. A good schedule for this then would to have the meat thawed out by dusk and then slide the bowl of food through the slot in the door that I mentioned in the Enclosure section. This will have the dual benefit of the food being available right for when your Pokemon wakes up, and getting them into a routine of where and when the food will be available. Then, at dawn, when these Pokemon are going to sleep for the day, you retrieve the dish. Unfortunately by entering the Enclosure, and wash it for the next night. Easy as can be. Since training for these Pokemon is a pointless effort, the last thing we need to go over in this guide is cleaning. You'll have to do the regular stuff like scoop up the waste and care for any of the plants that are in the enclosure. And for Venonat, that's pretty much it. It doesn't make too much of a mess. The issue comes with Venomoth and the scales that it puts out. Those of you who remember the Butterfree guide should remember that part of caring for that Pokemon was the fact that you had to clean up the discarded scales from building up in its enclosure. The same thing happens here, though it can end up being much more deadly. This is why I had you install that air filtration system in this enclosure. It'll help to keep the enclosure cleaner for longer, meaning you get longer breaks between cleanings. But you are still going to have to go in there and clean up the scales that manage to get around the air filter. To that end, you'll need to get fully dressed up in hazmat attire, so that when you're handling the scales, you're safe from their poison. As well, you should have a dedicated vacuum, dustpan, and broom that you use only for this job. That way you don't accidentally start spreading the poison around your own home or something like that. Then bag up the scales in a biohazard waste bag and dispose of them properly. It's a lot, and exposes you to a lot of risk while you're doing it, which is why for this one I had the filtration system installed. And don't forget to change out and replace those filters. Just like the scales, they should be handled with extreme care and disposed of in biohazard waste bags. Do not take any risks with this stuff, seriously. Cost. Your enclosure is going to be your biggest expense here. Putting together the building, all the decorations, the filtration system, and the specialized door, it's going to probably be custom built. And custom built buildings like this are never cheap, no matter if you're doing it yourself or having a company come in and build it for you. So when you're looking at it as a whole, it's gonna be in the very high category. The Pokemon also won't be cheap. Like I said, thanks to the poisonous nature of these Pokemon, not many breeders out there are even gonna have them. And to buy one is going to be a pretty penny because of all the work they have to put into raising and caring for them. Even getting one from the wild isn't going to be cheap, because I highly recommend you hire a professional trainer to go out and catch one for you. It won't be cheap, but it's better than you going out in the woods and getting poisoned with no one else around. Add in the price for the government license to have one, and you're looking at the high, possibly even the very high category. Last is the food, and here you won't have to break the bank for. The Caterpie meat that you'll need is cheap and plentiful. Plus, if you buy in bulk and freeze it, then it can last you longer and usually get it at a better price. In all, for a month of food, you're probably looking at the moderate category, maybe more, maybe less, depending on if you decide to go with a different kind of meat. Conclusion. I'm just going to say it straight out, these Pokemon are really only viable in a zoo setting, because of the toxicity and the ease they have to spread it. I mean, just being near them poses a health risk. I could only recommend these to people that are very, very used to handling dangerous Pokemon. Pure professionals with no small kids, no small Pokemon, and plenty of time and patience to devote to these Pokemon themselves. Venonat and especially Venomoth are not the average person's Pokemon. So if you are that kind of professional, or you own a zoo, then these might be the perfect Pokemon partners for you and you alone. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time when we cover the ground-dwelling Pokemon Diglett and its evolution Dugtrio. Have a wonderful night, everyone.